E.G.G. Egregious Games.
So if you haven't seen my last video, the true purpose for this channel, I want to reintroduce myself. Hello, my name's Greg, I talk about games, and I also sometimes make them. This channel was created not just to talk about games and game design, but to talk about the game I'm making and my own personal game dev journey. I've been learning Unity for the last 2 years, and the sensible advice that new devs are given is thus: don't start with a massive, ambitious dream project. Complete a bunch of smaller projects first. While I am not sensible, I do see the value in working on and completing smaller projects. So with that in mind, I decided that this summer I would enter my first game jam. For those who don't know, a game jam is where game devs challenge themselves to make a game in a very short time frame, usually a few days to a week. They all have different rules, but generally the point is to challenge yourself, learn new things, and meet new people in the same boat as yourself. The work of an indie dev is often quite isolating, so it can be very beneficial to make friends to lean on, learn from, and who might be good at things you're not so good at, like graphics, sound, or coding. So I went hunting for jams, and I found the Lost Relic Games jam, actually run by a fellow indie game dev on YouTube. The theme was to be announced on June 10th, and from then on I would have 9 days to produce a game. My first released video game. I was excited, but I was not ready. In the day before the jam started, I decided to start looking for a team on the Lost Relic Games Discord, and was lucky enough to run into Pohpu, a talented sound designer and musician who was also entering her first game jam. Initially, I was going to handle all the coding and Pohpu would be handling graphics and audio, but we quickly made the decision to get a dedicated artist on board and recruited Skeptic Moose. This turned out to be a very smart decision, not only because it allowed Pohpu to focus on the audio, but because Skeptic turned out to be an incredible artist who really delivered an incredible scene for us to create our game in. The jam's theme was Connection, very similar to GMTK's last theme, Joined Together, but even broader. Connection could mean physical, emotional, whatever we wanted. The idea in a jam is to spark creativity and do something you've not done before, and we certainly had no shortage of ideas. We took the initial weekend to brainstorm our concept. My first idea was some kind of puzzle platformer, where you swapped out cute animals as hats to say jump higher with a rabbit, dig through walls with the mole, pull objects with a chameleon's tongue, etc. I also had an idea inspired by my lizard friend Dende called Crazy Buddy. The idea is that it would be like a dog walking simulator, except it's not a dog, it's a weird insane creature who wants to eat other animals and is constantly pulling you towards them. You'd be attached to the Crazy Buddy by a leash, and you'd have to successfully navigate through levels and obstacles. With both ideas, I wanted to keep things light and dumb. After all, this was my first jam, and to attempt something too ambitious risked being unable to complete the game on time. While I knew the basics of C# and Unity, I still struggled with a lot of intermediate ideas, and much of my code was full of messy if-else statements and repeated code. I'd also never ever delivered a real project before. Then Pohpu, the sound designer, came up with what was to be our final idea. The idea was this: you're at an open mic night and about to play a song on guitar, but you get so nervous you forget all the lyrics you've written. So you look around the room and make connections between things you see in the room and lyrics you could sing. It's kind of like object association improv. Needless to say, we were all on board with the idea and set about planning it. The first day I'd planned to draft out the game loop and UI, get a project up on GitHub, and go from there. Right around this time is when I started freaking the fuck out. Making a game by myself was one thing, but now I was in a team. I had 2 other people now who were busting their ass to produce songs, sound effects, and a big beautiful scene full of objects and people. As the first 2 days passed, my teammates began to show the assets they'd created. But the game was still unplayable. It had been a while since I'd worked on my project in earnest, and the rust was really showing. The first day of earnest work, I decided to try out the 2021 version of Unity, reasoning that the jam was a good time to experiment with the new features. This ended up being a mistake, as I had to spend hours trying to fix an error, only to discover that it was an unfixable bug in Unity 2021. After messing with workarounds, I decided to just toss the first attempt and start afresh in good old 2020 Unity, which didn't have said unfixable editor bug. The rest of the day was spent trying to get dialogue boxes working. I was planning to implement some kind of RPG-like dialogue tree in order to choose which object to play next once an object had been clicked on by the player. But this turned out to be a rabbit hole of long-winded tutorials, each telling me different implementations. Meanwhile, the core gameplay loop I hadn't even started working on. By Tuesday morning, I realized I needed to reprioritize. Dialogue boxes were an external feature. I needed to focus on the internals, not even the meat of the game, the skeleton, then the meat, then the external features. And so, by Tuesday evening, I had buttons that, when pressed, would play one of two versions of a first stanza. There was more code behind the scenes. I had a prototype stanza queuer that would register clicked objects, but with only this much to show, I began to feel like an imposter. All the fears that nipped at my psyche, that I wasn't cut out for this, that I was in over my head, that I'd promised code I simply wouldn't be able to provide. I was still determined to finish the jam, but in the back of my head, I began to make contingency plans. Perhaps I could bring in another coder to finish what I'd started. I wondered what others in the jam would think of me and my failure, in particular my teammates. Thankfully, Skeptic Moose had been in jams before, and was able to reassure me that there was no right amount of progress to have made. And despite my doubts, I pushed on. If I failed to complete the game, it wouldn't be for lack of trying. All that time spent learning C# over the last 2 years, working on my game, watching tutorials and banging my head against problems, it had to be worth something. And the pressure turned out to be a catalyst. Driven by determination to not let down the teammates I'd promised a game to, I finally braved the Unity Discord to ask for help. We've all had bad past experiences in asking for help online. It's far less anxiety-inducing to simply Google answers to your questions, but sometimes you have specific problems that are nearly impossible to Google, and it's far more simple, direct, and helpful to just ask for help from more experienced coders. It turned out, the big boy coders on the Unity Discords weren't all intimidating. They helped me realize the difference between bugs and misunderstandings on my part, and showed me where I could improve my code. I realized that, instead of a huge, cumbersome set of switch statements, I could refactor my code to use dictionaries. Those brought new problems, but through my struggles, I learned new solutions. By Wednesday, something had changed in me, in the way I approached code. Somehow, all the disparate pieces of knowledge I'd acquired over the past 2 years started to fit together. I'd understood the principles of object-oriented programming in theory, but putting them into practice in a real-time situation made something click. Fueled by caffeine, I hammered away at the code, cutting away huge, cumbersome code walls to replace them with more elegant, refined construction. And where in the past, coding had given me a headache, here it began to feel fun. Immensely satisfying. Backed now by newly acquired confidence, I worked together with the team to hash out what would and wouldn't be possible in the time we had left. Old prospective ideas were replaced by new concrete ones. On Wednesday, the team met up through voice chat to make sure everyone knew the plan and what they had to do. And from then on, we worked. I had the whole system more or less working on Friday, complete with janky intro, but it was basic and buggy. At this point, the game had 7 objects around the room. 7 objects for 7 stanzas. By clicking on an object, you added it to a queue, which the player character would then sing. If there was no object queued, when it came time to sing the stanza, the player would mumble their way through the stanza instead, and the audience would accumulate discontent. 3 missed stanzas, and the player was out. But it didn't really resemble a game yet. If they wanted, the player could find every object in the first 30 seconds of the game and then spend the next 3 minutes watching the song play out. It needed more interactivity. In the back of my head, I'd known this all along, but in all honesty, my main concern up to that point had been simply making the game work, having something that I could ship. Now that I was almost done, I knew I had time to address the core loop. At this point, I'd discarded my initial plan to have the player select an object by an RPG-style dialogue tree. It seemed like a cumbersome layer on top of simply clicking the object. The obvious implementation was to make it so the player could only queue one object at a time. The setting is improv. The player character is supposed to be coming up with the lyrics as you go. In fact, the song had guitar interludes, so it made sense to restrict the player's ability to cue objects to those interludes. When the player character stopped to play guitar solos, the player would then have a chance to choose their next object. With this design decision, it meant that there was no longer any real need to have a cue containing multiple stanzas, and that meant I could delete an entire chunk of code that I'd spent ages figuring out. I didn't regret having built it because I learned a lot in the process, but in the future it'll be beneficial to plan ahead of time with the design so I don't end up coding obsolete systems. Another lesson learned in such a way that I won't ever forget it. It was also around this time that I learned that submissions closed on 3 PM Sunday for me. And so I began the final full day. On Saturday, I revamped the entire stanza queuing system, adding dialogue boxes for every object the player could click, making sure that the player had cues and clues for what they needed to do. I made the camera able to pan around, I added a windscreen, a game over screen, figured out how to reload a scene without it breaking due to weird Unity event shit, and finally added credits. I worked from about 10 AM until midnight before finally taking a break, for about half an hour to eat, then continued on through the night to fix every bug that had cropped up in the process. I also had to figure out how to export the build in such a way that it could be played in browser on itch.io, since I'd never done that before. It stopped working at 8 in the morning, some few hours before the deadline, and I had another momentary freakout before once again Discord saviors with answers to my dumb questions flew down to rescue me. And then, after a week that was even longer than the amount of rambling I've done in this video, I finally slept. And Marv's open mic was playable to the public. It's been a hell of a week, and it seems like people enjoy the game. As far as games go, it's very simple, but I can't say I'm not proud of pulling it together with my current abilities in such a short space of time. Of course, much of the credit goes to my teammates. Without Pohpu singing and sound mixing, and without Skeptic's cozy, dingy scene of painted patrons, the game would not have its signature character, that je ne sais quoi, that certain Marviness. I really wanted to document this whole experience. I feel like I really leveled up my coding skills, and I'm not talking in that JRPG max levels 99 kind of way. Oh no, I'm talking D&D scaling 20 levels, each level is a major milestone kind of level up. This was huge. Game jams, it seems, are like a condensed down form of the entire game development process, and as such they are absolutely invaluable to newcomers like myself. It feels like I've just spent a week in the hyperbolic time chamber, and it's filled me with the kind of excitement and deep satisfaction that only comes from following through, keeping a commitment you've made to yourself. For so many game devs, we aren't able to finish what we started. But this week, we did. I did. And now what I've made is something you can play with your own hands. So there you have it, the story of my first jam, an experience I will never forget. But not the last, I'm sure. As I mentioned in my previous video, while I plan to continue making all kinds of videos, be they discussions about design, dumb skits, or reviews, you're probably going to start to hear a bit more about game dev stuff. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, and you want to join me on this journey, make sure to click subscribe. And other than that, thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day.